This lesson briefly explains how memory works so that as we cover different study strategies that work, you know why they work. So I could just tell you to study, but I am hoping you don't just do whatever a teacher on the internet tells you to do. So you will be more motivated to study using the strategies I give you if you know why. To know why, we need to look at how memory works. And I think this is pretty interesting anyway. So let's get into it. There are 3 parts to memory, and this is just a brief overview of those parts and how they work. The first part is our short-term memory. So our short-term memory holds the information or experiences that we encounter for a very short time, usually a few seconds through to a few minutes. The short-term memory can only hold a certain amount of information. As new information keeps coming in, we forget old information. We aren't even aware of a lot of the information coming in and being held in our short-term memory. Imagine a lady walking past you and you don't really pay her much attention. But if your friend asked you what colour coat she was wearing just after she walked past, you could tell them. If that same friend asked you 1 week later instead, you would have no idea. That is because the information was in your short-term memory and was forgotten as you encountered new, more relevant information. The next part is our working memory, which helps us complete activities. We use our working memory when we are actively focusing on an activity. The working memory holds the pieces of information we are using or manipulating as we complete that activity. Working memory can only hold information temporarily while we are using it. So let's say in class you are doing a math problem and your teacher asks you to work out the answer to 5 times 5 and then add 2 plus 3 to the answer. Your working memory stores all of those numbers you need to complete the activity. So you work out 5 times 5 is 25 and your working memory holds on to the number 25 so you can use it soon. You then add 2 and 3 held in your working memory to get 5. And finally you add it to the 25 still in your working memory to work out that the answer is 30. The third part of our memory is our long-term memory. This can store huge amounts of information indefinitely. Think about everything you know now and your past experiences that you remember. These are all stored in your long-term memory. Information that your brain believes is important because it is used all the time or is needed for us to make decisions and function is stored in your long-term memory. Most of the time we aren't aware that it's there and we actually need to retrieve it from our long-term memory and bring it back into our consciousness before we can use it. So think back to that math question in the last example. To answer the question we needed to use our working memory, but we also needed to use our long-term memory. We likely learnt that 5 times 5 is 25. And if we've been using our 5 times tables at least some of the time, then we'd easily be able to retrieve the answer to 5 times 5. We also had to retrieve our understanding of number values and addition to work out that 3 plus 2 is 5 and 5 plus 25 is 30. So there are 3 parts to making a memory. The first part is encoding, and this is the first step where your brain processes the information that's coming in and combines it with other information that it's getting to try and make sense of what that information means. The next step is that it has to then store that information in your long-term memory. So it has to move it from your short-term and working memory into your long-term memory so that it can be held for a longer period of time. So during this time, your brain is making connections between that new information and what it already knows. And this step occurs without you even being aware of it. Your brain is doing that while you are relaxing or sleeping or focusing on something else. And the final part of memory is retrieval. And so this is where we get that information from our long-term memory back out into our working memory so that we can use it again. The first two steps occur when you learn the information in class and while you are resting. But the third part is achieved through studying. So think about your lessons. Your teachers don't just talk for an hour giving you more and more information. They teach you one concept and then they give you an activity that requires you to use this new information to complete the activity. This new information is then processed in your working memory and encoded as you do that activity so that it can then be moved to your long-term memory where it is stored. One problem though is that one activity isn't enough to convince your brain that this information is important enough to permanently keep in your long-term memory. Our brain needs to realize that we are using this information all the time or frequently, otherwise we will forget it. So there is so much content to get through in each subject that teachers don't have time to teach the same lesson 3 times. And so this is where studying comes in. You need to keep using this new information, and lots of evidence says at least 3 times, before your brain will keep it stored permanently in your long-term memory. So any information stored in our long-term memory can be retrieved in one of 3 ways. The first is recognition, and this occurs when you remember something that you have learnt before after seeing that information again. So you know the right answer when you see it. And this is because with recognition, your brain needs a cue or a trigger, something to make it remember that information that you have learnt. So the information is stored in your long-term memory, but you haven't made any pathways for getting that information from your long-term memory back out into your working memory. And so your brain needs something to prompt it to remember that information. The second way you can remember something you've learnt before is relearning. And so if you haven't used the information in a really long time, some of those pathways for remembering that information will have been switched off. So you've forgotten the information. So you need to relearn it again before you remember it. The good news is that it's much easier to learn it the second time round, because those pathways, that information is there, the pathways are there, but you just need to get them working again. You need to turn them back on. And the final way is recall, and this is what we want to achieve from studying. So this is where we can easily remember that information and pull it from our long-term memory back into our working memory so we can use it again, and we don't need a trigger. We don't need to see the information again to do this. We don't need to relearn it to do it, and this could be our 5 times tables. So you should or may be able to pull your 5 times tables without having to see the answer to remember that 5 times 5 is 25, depending on how much you've used your 5 times tables lately. So we need to practice retrieving information so that we can recall the memory when we need it, most likely in the exam. And so the easiest way to do this is to use active study strategies. So from learning about memory, we know there are 2 main reasons why we need to study. The first is to encourage our brain to store information in our long-term memory. And the second reason is to create pathways for retrieving that stored information from our long-term memory back into our working memory so that we can use the information to answer questions in the test. So if you want to know more about memory, you can watch the video below.